The story begins in silence. A desert wind sweeps across the mesas of the American Southwest, carrying with it the faint echo of a language older than any empire, ancient words carved into memory by centuries of oral tradition. To most of the world, these sounds meant nothing. To a small group of U.S. Marines in 1942, they would mean everything. When the Japanese Empire launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States entered a global conflict where information was as lethal as bullets. The Pacific War would not only be fought with tanks, ships, and aircraft, it would be fought with words, codes, and radio waves. And in that hidden war of intelligence, the U.S. military faced a devastating problem. Its communications were vulnerable. Japan's cryptographers were among the best in the world. Trained in mathematics, linguistics, and logic, they had cracked nearly every code the Allies had used in Asia. American diplomatic messages were routinely intercepted. Japanese analysts could track U.S. fleet movements and sometimes anticipate attacks before they occurred. American field codes, based on complex substitution ciphers and encryption tables, proved fragile under the pressure of war. The more the Allies relied on technology to communicate, the more the Japanese learned to listen. It was in this desperate context that the U.S. Marine Corps turned to an unlikely source, the Navajo Nation. In early 1942, a civil engineer named Philip Johnston approached the Marine Corps with an idea so unconventional that it bordered on absurd. Johnston was not a cryptographer. He was a World War I veteran who had grown up on the Navajo reservation as the son of missionaries. He spoke fluent Navajo and understood its uniqueness. To him, the language itself was a code, a system so complex and so unlike any other that even the most skilled linguists would struggle to understand it. Johnston believed the Navajo language could serve as the foundation for an unbreakable military code. At first, Marine officers were skeptical. The U.S. had experimented with Native American languages before. Choctaw soldiers had served as message carriers in World War I, but their communications had been limited and easily imitated once overheard. The Navajo language, however, was different. It was unwritten, phonetically irregular, and spoken fluently by fewer than 30 non-Navajos in the world. Its syntax and tonal nuances made it nearly impossible to transcribe accurately. If structured properly, it could become the perfect cipher. In February 1942, the Marine Corps approved Johnston's proposal and recruited 29 Navajo men for an experimental communications program. They became the first Navajo Code Talkers. At Camp Pendleton, California, these recruits faced a dual challenge. They had to adapt to the rigid discipline of Marine life while inventing an entirely new coded language. Their system would have to transmit messages quickly, accurately, and securely under combat conditions. The men began by creating an alphabet substitution, each letter represented by a Navajo word. But they soon realized this was too slow. So they developed a vocabulary-based code, replacing entire military terms with Navajo equivalents or descriptive analogs. For example, fighter plane became dahi-tihai, hummingbird. Submarine became bishlo, iron fish. Battleship was lotso, whale. Words for weapons, ranks, and tactics were built from familiar imagery of the natural world. The result was a linguistic masterpiece of both simplicity and impenetrability. Each message sent by a code talker had 2 layers of encryption. First, it used Navajo, a language incomprehensible to outsiders. Second, it encoded military terms within that language using symbolic substitutions. To a Japanese listener, the transmissions sounded like meaningless strings of syllables. To a trained Navajo Marine, they carried precise tactical orders. By August 1942, the system was ready for its first test in combat, the invasion of Guadalcanal. The code talkers deployed with the 1st Marine Division into some of the harshest fighting conditions in the Pacific. Communication lines constantly broke down in the chaos of battle. Field telephones were destroyed, runners were killed, and conventional radio codes took too long to encrypt. Yet the Navajo operators transmitted messages instantly, clear, accurate, and secure. Commanders soon realized they were witnessing a revolution. On Guadalcanal, the Code Talkers' messages helped coordinate artillery strikes, report troop movements, and direct reinforcements. Japanese intelligence, which had previously thrived on intercepting Allied transmissions, was suddenly blind. They could hear the signals, but they could not understand them. To them, it sounded like a strange chanting, rapid and alien. They recorded hundreds of these messages, sent them to Tokyo, and began a frantic effort to decode them. At the heart of Japan's cryptographic effort was Lieutenant General Seizo Arisu, the chief of military intelligence. Arisu had a reputation for brilliance. He had led the team that cracked several U.S. Army codes early in the war, but the Navajo transmissions defied every method he knew. Statistical frequency analysis failed. Linguistic pattern recognition yielded nothing. Even captured Allied cipher sheets offered no clues. In 1943, Japanese intelligence intensified its efforts. They recorded thousands of Navajo-coded transmissions from various Pacific islands. They employed dozens of analysts and even brought in linguists familiar with Native American languages from universities in occupied territories. None could make sense of it. The phonetics seemed inconsistent. Words changed depending on context. No recognizable alphabet could be derived. The Japanese concluded they were facing a new kind of machine encryption, something beyond their comprehension. What they didn't know was that the machine was human. By 1944, over 400 Navajo Code Talkers were operating across the Pacific, from Tarawa and Saipan to Peleliu and Iwo Jima. Their communications proved faster than any mechanical cipher device. A message that might take hours to encrypt and decrypt using standard methods could be transmitted, understood, and acted upon in less than a minute. In battle, that speed meant survival. At Iwo Jima, the Code Talkers reached their peak. 23 Navajo Marines operated continuously for nearly 48 hours during the opening assault. They transmitted over 800 messages without a single error. Orders for ammunition resupply, coordinates for naval bombardment, and casualty reports all moved seamlessly through the invisible web of Navajo communication. Marine commanders later stated that without the Code Talkers, the capture of Iwo Jima would have taken far longer and cost many more lives. Meanwhile, Japanese cryptanalysts continued their futile search for the secret. Declassified documents later revealed their desperation. They captured at least one Navajo-speaking soldier trained as a scout for the U.S. Army and tortured him for translations, but even he could not help them. The code was not simply Navajo. It was a hybrid system of military terms redefined through metaphor. A single word might mean one thing in conversation and another entirely in code. Without the codebook and without understanding the cultural framework behind it, decoding was impossible. General Arisu eventually admitted defeat. In post-war testimony, he stated simply, "We never cracked the Marine Code." For Japan's intelligence service, that failure carried profound consequences. From 1943 onward, the Imperial Command lost its ability to predict or counter American operations in the Pacific. Naval reinforcements arrived too late. Island defenses were overrun without warning. Convoys were ambushed with uncanny precision. The flow of information, once a Japanese advantage, had turned decisively against them. The irony was staggering. The United States had long sought to erase Native American languages and cultures through forced assimilation. Boarding schools punished children for speaking their mother tongues. Generations grew up believing their heritage was a liability. Yet in the fires of World War II, that same language became the key to victory. The Navajo Marines, many of whom had endured discrimination at home, now carried America's most vital secret weapon, their own words. Back in Washington, few knew of their existence. The Navajo Code remained classified until 1968. Even other branches of the military were unaware of its full scope. The Code Talkers themselves returned home in silence, forbidden to speak of their service. Many resumed ordinary lives as farmers, teachers, or laborers. For decades, their story remained hidden, overshadowed by larger narratives of tanks, planes, and generals. When the truth finally emerged, it stunned the world. Historians pieced together how 375 to 420 Navajo Code Talkers had served in the Pacific. They transmitted tens of thousands of messages without compromise. Their code, built on the structure of an ancient oral tradition, had achieved what no machine, mathematician, or cryptographer could: absolute security. In 2001, Congress finally recognized their contributions. President George W. Bush awarded the original 29 Code Talkers Congressional Gold Medals, with silver medals for the hundreds who followed. In ceremonies filled with tears and pride, the surviving Marines stood not only as war heroes, but as symbols of cultural endurance. Their story represented the triumph of identity over suppression, and the profound truth that diversity itself could be a weapon for freedom. Today, recordings of the Navajo Code are preserved in museums and archives, studied by linguists and cryptologists alike. The code is still unbroken. Its principles, simplicity, redundancy, and cultural grounding continue to inspire military communication systems. But beyond the technical achievement lies a deeper lesson. The Navajo Code Talkers remind us that language is not merely a tool for speech, it is a vessel of worldview. Every sound carries centuries of meaning, shaped by land, history, and spirit. When those Marines spoke across the airwaves of the Pacific, they were not just transmitting coordinates. They were carrying the soul of a people into the heart of modern war. For Japan's cryptographers, the mystery of the Navajo language remained unsolved until the end. They had approached it through analysis, numbers, and theory. But the secret was never in mathematics, it was in humanity. The Navajo tongue, forged in the red canyons of Diné Bikéa, carried something no algorithm could capture: life, rhythm, and connection. It was not a code to be broken, but a story to be lived. And in that story, the empire that sought domination through knowledge met its limits. The sound of victory, then, was not the roar of engines or the crash of waves. It was the voice of a Navajo Marine, calm and clear, speaking to his brother across static and chaos. Words ancient and eternal, guiding armies through fire and storm. Words the enemy could hear but never understand. As the war ended, Japan's cryptographic archives were emptied, their code machines dismantled. Yet the question lingered: how had the Americans done it? The answer would come decades later when historians uncovered the truth that one of the world's most advanced military powers had been defeated, in part, by the world's oldest form of encryption, language itself. The Navajo Code Talkers had proven something fundamental: that knowledge does not always come from laboratories or academies. Sometimes it comes from the wisdom of those long overlooked. In a century obsessed with technology, it was humanity that held the final key. Their legacy endures, not only in history books, but in the continuing survival of the Navajo language. Every word spoken today by their descendants is a reminder of that improbable victory, a victory of culture over conquest, of tradition over tyranny, of silence turned into strength. And so, the story of the Navajo Code Talkers stands as one of the greatest paradoxes of the modern age. A government that once tried to silence a language found salvation in it. A people once marginalized became indispensable, and a code born from the earth and sky of the American Southwest became the shield of democracy across the vastness of the Pacific. The Japanese never broke it. No one ever has. Even now, decades later, as historians and cryptographers revisit every cipher of the Second World War, the Navajo Code remains unique. Proof that genius can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that the voices once ignored can echo loudest through time. The war's end brought silence to the airwaves that had once crackled with coded Navajo transmissions. The Pacific was no longer alive with battle orders or naval coordinates, but with the slow work of rebuilding. Yet, even as the world celebrated peace, the Navajo Marines, who had carried America's secret weapon, returned home to a country that barely understood what they had done. Many of them stepped off the trains into the same prejudice they had left behind. Some were refused service in restaurants. Others returned to reservations still gripped by poverty, drought, and neglect. They had fought for a nation that had once stripped them of their language, and yet it was that same language that had shielded that nation in its darkest hour. Their valor had no parades, their names no headlines. They carried their medals quietly in drawers, their memories in silence. The code itself remained classified for 24 years. Veterans were ordered not to speak of it, even to their families. Husbands could not tell their wives what they had done. Fathers could not explain to their children why they had nightmares of static and gunfire. The war lived on in them, invisible and unspoken. But time has a way of uncovering truth. By the late 1960s, as historians and journalists revisited the Pacific campaigns, questions began to emerge about how U.S. communications had stayed secure when so many others had failed. When the documents were finally declassified in 1968, the truth stunned the public. The unbreakable code had not been born in a laboratory. It had been born in the red rock canyons of the American Southwest, among a people whose culture the government had once sought to erase. The revelation reframed the narrative of the Pacific War. Historians began to see that behind every major victory, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, there was a network of Navajo voices binding the operation together. Without them, orders would have faltered, timing would have slipped, and confusion could have turned success into catastrophe. Their presence became the unseen architecture of victory. In the Japanese archives, researchers found evidence of how deeply the mystery of the unbreakable code had haunted Tokyo's intelligence division. Lieutenant General Seizo Arisu's notes revealed months of frustration. His analysts transcribed endless strings of syllables. TL-adjective, e-acute adjective, che dagahai tata, but could find no patterns, no repetition, no clues. Their attempts at frequency analysis failed because Navajo's linguistic structure defied the logic of Western alphabets. Sounds could shift with tone, stress, and context. Verbs changed shape depending on who performed the action. Entire sentences could be expressed in a single word. The Japanese cryptographers didn't just lack the code, they lacked the worldview to understand the language itself. To them, it was noise. To the Marines, it was clarity. In one declassified post-war interview, a Japanese linguist recalled his bewilderment. It was as if the Americans were speaking in sound patterns designed to deceive the mind, he said. We could hear it perfectly, record it perfectly, and yet it was like music with no meaning. That statement captured the essence of what the Navajo had created, not a cipher, but an art form of communication, a system that drew strength from human culture, not from machines. As Allied intelligence analyzed the same phenomenon after the war, they realized how extraordinary the Navajo achievement had been. It was not just the code itself, but the speed and accuracy of its use that made it superior. The code talkers could encode and decode a 3-line message in about 20 seconds, what had taken a cipher machine half an hour. On the battlefield, that difference saved lives. During the Battle of Iwo Jima, for example, Marine units relied on constant coordination between the beaches, artillery batteries, and command ships offshore. Traditional encryption would have crippled the pace of command, but the Navajo teams transmitted fluidly. They relayed coordinates for naval bombardment, reported enemy counterattacks, and directed medevac requests. When the Japanese launched counter-barrages, the Navajo operators shifted frequencies instantly, staying one step ahead of jamming efforts. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division's signal officer, later said, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." At the same time, Japan's Imperial General Staff was unraveling. The Empire's once formidable intelligence network, which had penetrated Allied radio systems in 1941 and 1942, now faced dead air. Every attempt to decode Marine communications ended in failure. Some Japanese officers began to suspect that the Americans had discovered a revolutionary machine, a mechanical brain capable of generating infinite linguistic permutations. They could not conceive that the key lay in a living tongue. The paradox of the Navajo Code was that its security came not from complexity, but from understanding. The men who created it drew upon the natural world they had known since childhood. The word for a bomber was Jaysho, buzzard. A destroyer became Kalo, shark. The code's power came from metaphor, not mathematics. It was intuitive to its speakers, indecipherable to all others. In the heat of battle, that intuition allowed them to think and act faster than any machine. Beyond the battlefield, the Navajo achievement represented a turning point in how America viewed its indigenous peoples. For generations, native languages had been forbidden in schools. Children were beaten for speaking them. Cultural identity was seen as a barrier to modernization. Yet in war, those same voices had safeguarded the nation's freedom. The Code Talkers became living proof that the United States' greatest strength lay not in conformity, but in diversity. When President Ronald Reagan declared August 14, 1982, as National Navajo Code Talkers Day, it was not only a commemoration of military service, it was an act of restoration. The country was finally beginning to acknowledge that the very culture it had tried to suppress had once saved it. Later, in 2001, when surviving Code Talkers received the Congressional Gold and Silver medals, they stood before a nation that now saw them not as relics of the past, but as heroes of history. Their ceremony in Washington, D.C. was humble but profound. Some of the men wore their Marine uniforms, faded with time. Others wore traditional jewelry and turquoise. One spoke softly in Navajo before switching to English. "We are proud that our language was our weapon. It helped our people and all Americans." That simple statement carried a weight generations in the making. In the years that followed, museums across the country began to preserve their legacy. The National Museum of the Marine Corps constructed a full-scale replica of a Code Talker radio post, complete with field telephones, static hiss, and the hum of jungle insects playing in the background. At the Smithsonian, linguists displayed side-by-side comparisons of Navajo words and their coded equivalents. Visitors could see how poetic imagery, bear, eagle, thunder, became tools of modern warfare. Meanwhile, in Japan, historians began their own reckoning. At universities in Tokyo and Kyoto, scholars studying wartime intelligence re-examined the records of the failed decoding efforts. They recognized that the inability to break the Navajo Code was not just a technical failure, but a cultural one. Imperial ideology had taught them that primitive peoples could not possess sophisticated knowledge. That arrogance blinded them to the truth, that wisdom often resides in the places the powerful overlook. The irony was profound. The empire that had sought to dominate Asia through uniformity and control was defeated in part by a people whose strength came from cultural uniqueness. In this sense, the Navajo Code Talkers' triumph was not only military, it was philosophical. It showed that diversity itself was a form of defense, that survival depended on voices kept alive through generations of resilience. Even as the war receded into memory, the echoes of those transmissions lingered in the desert air. Many of the Code Talkers returned to the Navajo Nation carrying stories they could not tell, but carried them nonetheless, in their songs, in their prayers, in their silence. Some suffered from the same trauma that haunted all veterans of the Pacific, memories of blood, fire, and comrades lost. Yet within that pain lived pride. They had served their country with honor and protected their people's language from extinction, not through defiance but through duty. Decades later, when historians interviewed surviving Code Talkers, they spoke not of glory but of balance. One elder said, "The war took much from us, but it gave our language back its spirit." Another remarked, "We were told our words were worthless. Then the Marines said they were worth victory." These reflections revealed something deeper, that the Navajo Code was more than a tactical innovation. It was a reconciliation between two worlds. The old and the modern, the native and the national, joined together in the shared pursuit of survival. In the digital age, cryptographers still study the Navajo system. It remains one of the few wartime codes never broken by human or machine. Modern algorithms can simulate frequency distributions and linguistic trees, but without understanding the worldview embedded within the Navajo tongue, the code remains a mystery. That resilience underscores an enduring truth about communication. Meaning is not just in symbols, it's in the people who carry them. In classrooms across the Navajo Nation today, young students learn both English and Navajo. Teachers tell them the story of the Code Talkers not only as history, but as heritage. They play old radio recordings from the Pacific, and students listen to the voices of their grandfathers echoing through time, firm, calm, unshakable. The words that once guided Marines through gunfire now guide new generations through the complexities of identity and belonging. In this way, the story continues. The code that once united an army now unites a people. The lessons it carries stretch beyond war. It teaches that every culture holds knowledge of immense value, that no language is lesser, and that survival sometimes depends on remembering what others forget. As the last of the original code talkers pass away, their legacy becomes part of a greater human story. The victory of creativity over conquest, of language over silence. From the beaches of Iwo Jima to the deserts of Arizona, their voices remain, carried on the wind like whispers of history. And somewhere in the archives of time, the Japanese intercepts still sit, pages of sounds without meaning, records of a mystery never solved. To read them now is to hear the distant heartbeat of two worlds colliding, one seeking domination through understanding, the other finding victory through identity. The code remains unbroken because it was never meant to be broken. It was meant to be spoken, to live, to breathe. That is its final brilliance. The last transmission faded into static long ago, but the message endures. When humanity forgets the value of its own diversity, it risks defeat. When it remembers, it becomes unstoppable. The Navajo Code Talkers proved that truth not with speeches or slogans, but with voices carried across the chaos of war, voices that spoke of earth, sky, and courage, and in doing so changed the course of history.